Welcome back to Unboxing Logistics, everyone. You know the drill. I'm your host, Lori Boyer from Easy Post. And I am you guys are in for a treat today because we have a fantastic guest. Barely needs introduction from me, Benjamin Gordon. He has seen logistics, I feel like, from every side, every angle. He's been operator, deal maker, investor now. He built and sold a logistics company to Maersk. He's advised big names like UPS, DHL on billion-dollar deals. Today, he runs Cambridge Capital, where he basically has to have all the knowledge to know what he thinks is going to be the future in the logistics industry. And he also runs the BGSA Supply Chain Conference. You know, that's basically the power summit conference of our industry, where all the biggest CEOs, investors, innovators in supply chain meet, figure out what's going on. And I was just really excited to have Ben on today. I have to also throw in, you went to both Yale and Harvard. Was that right, Ben?
I did. Not because I got kicked out of one, but one was
Oh,
great.
okay.
Yeah.
You were the troublemaker, huh?
Well,
So, Ben, tell us a little bit. Anything I've missed? Anything you'd want our audience to know about you and your background?
Lori, such a great introduction. Thank you. I think anything I say won't match up to the fantastic billing, but I appreciate it. So thank you. Great to be with you.
Well, I'm excited. And, I really was thinking, I was telling him beforehand that I was really thinking through which topic we should discuss because he has incredible content and thought leadership out there that I've read. And so today we're going to be talking a little bit about AI. I'm really excited about that. But before we do, Ben, why don't you go ahead? One thing we've been doing this season in our podcast is asking people to share a person in the industry that you just really admire and kind of why. So I would love to hear from you, having been around for a hot minute.
Well, thank you. And there are lots of amazing people that I've had the opportunity to work with, including, sadly, the late Fred Smith, who just passed away very recently. Hundreds of CEOs that I've worked with, either invested in their companies or advised. But I'm going to go old school and tell you that one person in the transportation industry who I admire, who's the reason I got into this industry, is my grandfather. And the reason is because my grandfather actually started a car dealership business back in 1948. And the reason he got into the business was the job that he really wanted, he couldn't get. He wanted to go into the steel industry. And his dad had a small steel business. They did business with Bethlehem Steel. He couldn't get hired into the management training program at Bethlehem Steel. And so he said, okay. And as is the case with so many great entrepreneurial stories, he turned adversity into success. He went into another car business and then said to the owner, here's the deal. I'm going to be the hardest working, best employee you've ever had. And then in 4 years, I would like your permission to let me buy you out, which is a pretty, let's just say, I don't know a lot of 21-year-olds that would say that, ballsy. And, uh, and guess what? He did, bought it, rebranded it, built it out his way, grew it, and then moved into truck leasing and started a dedicated contract carriage business that would ultimately evolve into logistics. And so the reason I got into this industry, I didn't want to be the guy that had a job because he was related to somebody else. So I went my own way. But I mean, after Yale, I went into strategy consulting, worked at a Bain spinoff called CDI, then Harvard Business School. And while I was there, I wrote what I thought was going to be the business plan for a technology division, an internet division that would help my grandfather automate part of his logistics company, AMI, because they had in a room probably smaller than the room you're sitting in right now, they had a couple of guys on phones calling, trying to broker freight. So they would have dedicated lanes. So the lanes would be full going one way, empty coming back. The brokers would try to fill the lanes. And I said, hey, there's this thing called the internet. I bet we could do this more efficiently. And I pitched my grandfather on it. And of course, in true nerdy fashion, I wrote an 86-page business plan. And And in true old school focus on what matters fashion, my grandfather read the first 4 pages and then closed it and said, "Well, I've seen enough." So I said, "Well, what do you think?" He said, "It's a good plan." I said, "Well, do you want to do it?" He said, "No, my plan's better." I said, "Well, what's your plan?" He said, "Well, I'm selling my company." So, and he did. So he sold his company. Today it's a part of Penske. Um, but it gave me the catalyst because I thought, okay, I spent all this time creating this idea. It's not going to work here. Why don't I just turn this into a startup? And so I did. And that company in 1999 became Threeplex, which would be one of the first SaaS TMS companies. So, I learned a lot from my grandfather, learned a lot about the value of grit, of tenacity, of judgment, people judgment, situational judgment, willingness to know when it's time to get out of the details and pull back. But I owe him the inspiration for starting my first company. So thanks to his not going with my idea, gave me the catalyst to go start it.
I love that. And what was his name? Is he still around?
No, no, he passed away
Okay.
in 2010. His name was Gene Ribicoff.
Gene. Okay. Love that story. I especially love the fact that he said no, because it is one of those life lessons as well for you is like, when are there times that you need to say no? Like, this isn't the right move today. And I think, especially as kind of an investor or whatnot, there's a lot of times where doesn't mean that the idea was bad. It just wasn't right for that time in that place. So
That's
totally,
right.
totally love that. That's amazing. Okay, Ben, you've been around in logistics, uh, you know, since a long time before AI sort of became our buzzword. Um, when you look at sort of today's AI boom, what kind of parallels do you see maybe to earlier waves of tech hype in logistics? Sometimes I hear people say, "Oh, this is just another thing, another big tech thing." I guess, why do you think it is such a huge topic? I can't go to a conference for like a second without seeing AI everywhere. What is your impression? What's the Ben Gordon take on it all?
Well, look, my take is on the one hand, we are in a hype cycle. On the other hand, there is no doubt that AI has the capacity to totally transform not just logistics, but everything, but particularly logistics because AI is outstanding in areas that one are process intensive, and there are an awful lot of processes to automate. Two, document intensive, and if you look at the fact that here we are all these years later, and there's still a tremendous amount of EDI, and there's still a tremendous amount of Excel-based work. There's a lot of data workflow, process, and transaction intensity. AI is really a perfect tool to help automate all that. And then lastly, it also addresses the thing that I think has been a hurdle for so many prior technologies, which is the natural language processing makes it easy to use. You don't have to be an engineer to use it. All this talk about vibe coding and the idea that you or I or somebody else that isn't a trained engineer can use AI to do things that took much more technical training before. Now, natural language processing makes it possible. So I think all that's great. What does it remind me of? Well, it reminds me of what we were just talking about. It reminds me of 1999. Uh, right? Why? Because in 1999, what people said about the internet, in many respects, is similar to what people say about AI now. They said, number one, it's going to transform the industry. It did. Number two, interestingly, they said, well, the internet's going to cut out the middleman. So is logistics, our truck brokers going to go away? Well, obviously, that proved not to be true. It turned out that it became a powerful tool to automate brokers, not to replace them. Um, okay, number three, people assign tremendous valuations. So much so, I mean, it's interesting. I was talking with Tom Sanderson recently. Tom was the CEO of Transplace. When Transplace was formed, it was the logistics arms of 6 different trucking companies. They formed it in 2000, and they thought, hey, if we call it Transplace, add a .com at the end, and then go for a plan to try to take it public, we will instantly massively increase the value of our trucking companies just by virtue of the share that we hold in this. Now, of course, that was crazy, right? It didn't actually make sense. But the substance underneath all that was legitimate. Internet-powered businesses made a huge impact. And I think the same is true here. So is there lots of hype? Yes. Will a lot of companies fail? Yes. But in the end, will AI be a tremendous source of productivity gain for companies that use it well? Absolutely. Just like it was the case with the internet and those that were early adopters and companies that used threeplex and others back in '99. I think the same is true today.
I love that. I love because it's like similarly with the internet, we don't know for sure exactly what changes it's going to implement. And sometimes maybe we'll think it's going to, spur a change here or there, and then it doesn't, but it does it in a different way. So that's super exciting. One of the articles I read of yours, you said AI should not be just a shiny dashboard. Sometimes I've seen that as well, like people saying it just looks good in a sales deck sometimes, right? It has to actually get your data and turn it into action. So we have a lot of shippers listening out there. If I'm that shipper, how can I tell the difference maybe between something that really is going to work and something that is just sort of a shiny dashboard? It's just hype. I like to think you're saying right along this, AI is sort of like the most overhyped but kind of underused and taken advantage of tool because of these shiny dashboard sort of views. What is your advice for shippers?
Number one is start with a clear definition of the business problem, right? What is it that I'm trying to solve? I'll give you an example. Green Screens, which is a company that I co-founded 5 years ago, and it was focused on AI-powered predictive pricing for trucking, focused on one very specific problem. There's no ambiguity about it. In fact, we wouldn't have even called it an AI company. We called it a predictive pricing company because the focus was the problem. What was the problem? Well, if you were a truck broker or shipper or a carrier for that matter, it's tremendously important for you to know how should you price. If I've got a truckload of freight going from Salt Lake City to Miami, and I get the price wrong, it makes a big difference. Now, if you're a carrier and you get the price wrong, it matters. If you're a truck broker, and right now average margins, gross revenue to net revenue, are about 12% in the industry. If you get that wrong, if you were off by 6%, right, that could be the difference between making normal money versus making net of everything, because at 6% margin you're actually losing money when you fully load it with all of your costs. That's a big difference. And it turned out that NFI, a major logistics company, did a study, and they found that using the other 60% market share company in pricing, they found a 20% error rate in in the pricing that they got. So if you have a 20% error rate and a 12% margin, you're pricing at a gross margin loss an awful lot of the time. So this was the big problem. The issue was not AI. The issue is solve the problem.
Well, wait. Okay, I gotta pause that. That was so good, man. The issue is not AI. The issue is solve the problem. That's critical right there. Okay, go ahead. I just love that. That was genius.
By the way, I mean, you see this whenever a company leads by saying, I am fill in the blank, something that, that sounds shiny. Usually that's a sign that they're not the best at the problem. There's a saying in law, which is, if the facts are on your side, cite the facts. If the facts are not on your side, cite the law. And if the law's not on your side, pound the table.
I come from a long
like that.
line of lawyers, so I totally
Okay.
know what you're talking about.
You know that, yeah. So
Mhm.
to me, people that start by saying I'm an AI company, that's the equivalent of pounding the table. Whereas if the facts are on your side, you lead with the facts, which in this case, was solve the problem. And the problem was get the pricing right. So for Green Screens, it was focus on the problem and then communicate with truck brokers. Truck brokers were the ones that needed it the most because given that thin margin and wide dispersion based on getting the pricing wrong if you were using DAT or somebody else, it really mattered to get it right. And guess what? The early adopters were all major truck brokerage companies. And so within, I don't know, 2 years, something like 150 of the top 200 truck brokers, something like that, all, signed on because it was such a clear, compelling value proposition. They weren't doing it because of AI. They were doing it because it helped them boost their margin because they're getting the pricing right. So I think lesson number one is look for companies that are laser focused on the problem that you care about. And I think that's a big deal.
Can I ask one question there? So I've talked about this a little bit before, where some of the best AI tools are kind of vertical. They go deep on one specific niche, rather than really broad and horizontal. And then I've had a few people question me when I go that way, my tech stack sort of starts to blow up with too many tools. Do you have advice for that? There's not always a great, easy answer, but I'd love to hear what you say.
Yeah, so a couple things. I mean, this also comes to the question of, do you want a bundle or a series of great point solutions? And in the early stages of innovation, the point solutions are almost always better. Same was true with the internet. You looked at the best internet companies, 99, 2000, 2001, you would have one company for one feature, another for another, et cetera. And then eventually, as the market matured and consolidated, some big platforms came out of it. And of course, those platforms included large TMS providers, and then people that would aggregate other capabilities, someone today, like a Blue Yonder would be an example, or an Infor. And so, you have that maturity cycle. Well, today, because of the early stage of AI, you are usually better off picking individual point solutions that are great. But there will come a time in the next 3 to 5 years where that evolves, and then you'll be able to find integrated platforms that could do it all. It's actually part of the reason why Green Screen sold to Triumph, because the Green Screen's strategy was be the best at one thing, predictive pricing. And then there were other individual companies that Green Screens thought were great in different areas, whether it was in capacity or visibility or TMS or otherwise. So instead of doing all those things themselves, Green Screen said, "Hey, we'll be like it'll be like the open architecture platform, right? Like you could be Apple and you're the walled garden and everything has to happen inside, or you could be the open architecture and you're like Android and you've got all these other companies and partners." And it turned out that at this stage of the game, the open architecture, pick your best partners approach, I think made more sense. But we also knew that a time would come when this market would consolidate. And so one of the reasons why Green Screens ultimately sold to Triumph was Triumph had lending, factoring, a whole series of intelligence capabilities, and predictive pricing fit into that strategy and fit into that bundle. So now Triumph plus Green Screens, there's a bigger bundle. And so much in the same way, these point solutions from the internet days evolved into bigger platforms. I think that's what we're starting to see now with AI, and Green Screens Triumph is a good case study.
Yeah, so we're just on the cusp of moving from individual point solutions to maybe some more. So hang in there is kind of what I'm hearing. We're still a little bit in early days, but eventually our tech stack isn't going to blow up. So,
Yes.
okay, getting us back on board. So our first thing that we need to look for is that you're actually solving a pain. So one thing I kind of loved with that is sometimes I feel like I talk to shippers, and I love you guys. I talk with you all the time. And sometimes though you're out looking for an AI solution just to see where can AI fit into my business instead of love what Ben said. What problems are you having? It doesn't matter if it's AI or something else. Find solutions to your problems. Don't find ways to fit AI into your business. So, okay, first thing, start with the problem. Then you got a second one.
So then the second one is make sure that there are other adopters that look like you that are getting tangible benefit. Now, this is really important. And look, I'm an investor. At Cambridge Capital, we invest in great supply chain companies. We have 8 portfolio companies, and I've invested in dozens of others over the course of my career. And the number one thing that earlier stage companies that succeed tend to do really well. Well, I think there are two. One is focus on the problem, but the second is show the use case. In other words, give an example of somebody else that's using it. Show the case study. What was the problem they had before? What else did they consider? Why did they choose you? How easy was it to get started? And then lastly, what were the results? Now, those 5 elements are super important. It's very logical, simple, and straightforward, but not a lot of people do a great job of systematically demonstrating that. If they do that, two great things happen. One is, from a marketing standpoint, they do a better job of conveying the value. So if you're a shipper listening to this and you're looking at an AI-powered supply chain technology company, you ought to ask them, show me the case studies that take you through that. They do a good job of that, then great. It's going to be better for, for you and better for them. But there's also a second benefit. The second benefit is it creates a feedback loop. And that's really important because the best the best companies, period, tend to be really good at saying, okay, I'm going to get this out to the market. I'm going to listen to the customer's feedback, and then I'm going to make sure that that gets recycled into the next iteration. And so, again, with green screens, NFI was a great early adopter because they were a terrific truck brokerage company demanding high standards, but also representative of what lots of other truck brokerage companies cared about. So you knew that if you did a great job for them, there would be 200 other companies with similar goals and needs. And so you got to pick the right early adopter. But if you pick the right early adopter, you're going to get a great virtuous circle of feedback loop. And so, NFI used it and said, well, this is great, but you're missing a few things. And we get all this value in these lanes because you've got high volume. You don't have as much volume in these other lanes. So what do you do? Well, guess what? Green Screens then said, okay, let's take that back to the product side and create sort of a green, yellow, red rating system so that if the lane had high confidence because it had high volume, it would be marked differently. And on the other hand, if you didn't have as much data, you let them know so that maybe they don't put as much weight on what the system says because the system hasn't been trained as effectively as high volume. You wouldn't know that, or at least you wouldn't know that instantly unless it was out in the market and you had that tight feedback loop. So I think that process is super important.
Okay, you broke this down so well. So if you are looking at AI, step one, is it solving a problem? So maybe there's a great idea, we've got a problem, it's being solved. Step two, does it actually work? Because sometimes there's a lot of ideas and you get that through use cases. What can they share with you? Is it actually working? And then moving on, are they iterating upon that? Are they making changes and listening to customers and getting the feedback and growing? Fantastic advice there on how to find the right AI. I have a question. I'm wondering, you mentioned the problems being solved. Are there certain problems that you feel like right now, kind of the stage we're at in AI, in the logistics and supply chain industry that are most likely to be solved by AI? What kind of areas, what problems are the biggest pain points that it's solving?
Well, I'll give you a couple. One is in the realm of post-purchase tracking and visibility. So you buy something online, then what? Okay, so and everybody besides Amazon is struggling with this question because everybody wants to be able to give their customer an experience that's equal to or better than that, because otherwise, why would a consumer buy on any site other than Amazon? And a big part of that is the post-purchase experience. You could think of that as several elements. One is tracking, where's my stuff, and visibility and the analytics around that.
Which
And
is
then there's also
massive.
which
Yeah.
is super important, as you know, and of course, relevant to Easy Post as well. And then there's the issue of the customer communication, right? So the consumer wants to know when they write to you and say, well, "Where's my stuff?" or whatever, and do they get some sort of automated bot that doesn't really tell them anything and just makes them frustrated, or does it say, "We'll get back to you in 2 business days," which is not the answer that you want, or does it give them a direct answer, and B, a positive tone and level of constructive engagement that makes them feel good about you? Because what brands I think often underappreciate is the supply chain is the weak link in the brand process.
Supply chain is the weak link in the brand. That is incredible. Right there, you could take that and go with it. So anyway, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I'm a runner, and I'm going to be in the Catskill Mountains for my half brother's wedding next week. So I bought some Salomon, trail running shoes, and the shoes weren't the right size. So I wrote back, telling me about the returns process, and when you get an automated email that says, "Well, we'll get back to you in 2 business days," no matter how great I might feel about that shoe or that brand, uh, boom, they just lose customers when something like that happens. So the supply chain is the weak link in the consumer brand experience. And if you're a brand and you're listening and or CPG company, you're thinking about that, what you should be thinking is not how much am I spending on post-purchase tracking and visibility in the customer communication side. What you should be thinking is how much does it cost me to acquire a new customer? And if I lose them because of this, how much does it cost to have to go replace and do another? There's an interesting study on customer loyalty by Bain a few years ago that showed that uh, the cost of people usually underestimate how much it costs to win a new customer, and but the cheapest new customer is always keeping the one that you already have. And so when you think about it that way, number one, it means that you should be thinking more about investing in that post-purchase experience to make sure that you keep your future customers, keep them happy, keep them engaged. And then, and this is to come back to your AI question, how can you use AI to do a better job of customer engagement? There's no excuse in the world of AI today to not have an instant answer to a customer question like that. Where's my stuff? Should never be, we'll get back to you in 2 business days, or any variation of that. So turns out that in that post-purchase arena, there's a company called Parcel Perform, which, of course, I think so highly of them that I invested in the company, and put my money where my mouth is. And what they do is specialize in exactly that, and they power marketplaces and brands and companies like Shopify and Espresso and a variety of others. So they're really good at it. What they are increasingly doing is using AI to look for patterns. And for example, wouldn't it be good to know that if you're, an e-commerce marketplace, that whatever ships out on Tuesdays tends to be, faster than what ships out on Fridays, maybe because there's a lull over the weekend. And does that maybe influence? Do you want to do more to push promotions on a Tuesday than a Friday? Because that way the customer gets it faster, then they're happier, then they have a better experience, and there's a whole virtuous cycle that comes out of that. Or maybe it turns out that there's AI-powered analytical work that you could do to figure out that some carriers do a better job for you in certain situations. And maybe you want to allocate the right orders to the right carriers at the right time. And there's just all kinds of interesting analytical stuff that you can do. So I think, look, post-purchase is one great example of where I think AI has immediate application.
I love that. And I am so on board with you. Of course, it's interesting to be in this industry because we're the consumer ourselves as well, right? So we
Right.
all have our shipping experience. And I'm a mom and I have 7 kids.
Wow.
And let me tell you, we do a lot of shipping. And yeah, it can be just a horrible experience for me where, I'd like to tell people, I don't blame the carrier, which I should. When something gets lost or something, I'm looking at the brand and I'm saying, this didn't show up. And, I also don't care which carrier's bringing it. I just want it to come. And so yeah, that's fantastic. Well, I want us to pivot just a tiny bit because I've heard you talk about that you feel like we're going into kind of the 4th wave of supply chain transformation. I would love to hear a little bit about what that means, what you think that means, and maybe kind of where AI fits in since that's our conversation today.
If we zoom super high level, 50,000 feet, waves of innovation in supply chain, you could argue that um, a first wave in the US supply chain was in 1869, because that was the year of the golden spike in Promontory, Utah, that connected East Coast and West Coast, of course, in Utah, to create the first transcontinental railroad. Why was that important? Well, it finally meant that you could ship something coast to coast in an efficient manner, right? I mean, what were your alternatives back then? Horse and buggy? I mean, it was there were not great alternatives. It wasn't like today. You didn't have airplanes and a highway system and everything else. So guess what? Not only did that create multi-billion-dollar fortunes for the railroad owners, but also for people that could use those railroads to ship things more efficiently. And so yes, you had people like here I am in our offices in West Palm Beach. Florida was built by Henry Flagler. Henry Flagler, of course, built the Florida East Coast Railroad. Um, but he also was partners with John Rockefeller in Standard Oil. Well, Standard Oil, in part, made a fortune by virtue of being able to do low cost shipping of oil that the railroads facilitated. So, again, the immediate winners were those that built it, but then you also had the people that were able to benefit from it. So I would say that was a first wave. Second wave came when a man named Malcolm McLean figured out that he could take containers from railroads. Again, that there's a theme here that and put them in steamships. And he took an old oil tanker and put these containers in it and said, "Hey, it'd be a lot cheaper and faster if instead of packing ships item by item. I mean, think about how inefficient that is. To put a box here, a little parcel one at a time into an entire ship. A, it costs a lot. B, there was all kinds of theft. C, there's all kinds of inefficiency with the loading and unloading. Malcolm McLean figures out in the 1950s that he could do something called containerization. So he invents containerized shipping. And interestingly, the port in the Northeast that had the most volume at the time was New York, Port of New York. The gangs of New York tells you something about what it was like back then. There was a lot of theft and a lot of inefficiency. He said, "No, we're going to do a deep water port in Newark," and the first route was Newark to Houston. That carried that containerized ship. And by virtue of figuring this out, first of all, Malcolm McLean made a fortune building sea land and then selling it to Maersk. And so, of course, that was great for the steamships, but it was also great for the people that could take advantage of high volume, low cost shipping. And so, if you think about it, Walmart, Costco, Target, like these retail powerhouses today exist in their current form only because of Malcolm McLean containerization. Because without containerization, you would not be able to buy, the shirt that you're wearing or sit on the chair that you're sitting on for anywhere close to the price that you paid for it. Now, we all benefited from that because low-cost manufacturing offshore, whether in China or elsewhere, low-cost shipping to bring it here. In the end, the reason why supply chain as a percent of GDP has dropped by about 10 points from 1980 to the present, which if you think about a $20 trillion economy, that's $2 trillion of annual savings. It's because of this supply chain innovation. So massive. Well, now we move to the third wave. Third wave is the internet.
I was gonna say, I'm thinking it's the internet. Okay.
Exactly. So here we are, back to the internet. So in the 90s, and you could say that the launch of Amazon Prime, a couple of years thereafter, I think 2003, is a good milestone for that. What did that do? It made it possible. If the first two innovations were about low cost, high volume shipping, the third was about personalized shipping. You could get things delivered to you faster, cheaper, better than ever before. But it also created all kinds of other ripple effects. It was great for Amazon, but it was also great for all these e-commerce logistics companies. I mean, look, EasyPost is a participant in that ecosystem too, just as so many other great supply chain technology companies. So we're all living through that one. I won't say more about it. So now the question you've asked is, what's the fourth wave? And the fourth wave, in my view, is possibly about how people can use AI to make better decisions. The big transformations, I think, are one, being able to take all this data to make much better decisions, whether green screens with predictive pricing or partial perform with the post purchase. You could look at someone like autoscheduler.ai, which is really a layer that sits on top of the WMS that it creates much easier to use analytics tools, labor management, et cetera, or dozens of other AI-powered applications. But basically, this is going to change all kinds of workflows. Fundamentally, if companies can build businesses, one of the things that people talk about in Silicon Valley today are the rise of tiny companies. The idea that you could have 1, 2, 3, 4 people that builds a multi-$100 million business. And there's a wager right now who will be the first one employee company to build a $1 billion business. These things all sound crazy, but the reality is technology and AI in particular makes it possible to do so many things in an automated way that wouldn't otherwise have been the case. So will AI powered supply chain be the fourth big wave? Maybe. We'll see. This would be a good topic to look back on, say, 3 years from now.
I know. I'll have to have you back and we can like review everything. AI is super fun and exciting for me on just that nerd brain who loves to see fundamental shifts in how society's working and everything. So I love this. Um, okay, we're kind of running out of time, wrapping up here. What excites you for the next like 5 years? What kind of maybe some Ben Gordon predictions? What do you think is going to be exciting? And I'd love you to end with any sort of piece of advice for all of those who are listening today. One thing they can do maybe to kind of get started or something from you.
Three things that I'm excited about and that I expect will happen. One is that maturation that we talked about from these point solutions to platforms, that's happening now. Green Screen's Triumph is one example. What DET is trying to do with Convoys and other, truck stop, with their acquisition of Denim a couple of days ago, another. Like the platforms looking to take on more. So I think one clear theme is you're going to see the big get bigger. You're going to see a handful of major platforms emerge, and it'll be an interesting battle to see who the winners are. The three companies that I named are all combining supply chain and finance in different ways, right? So if you think about it, Triumph started on the finance side as a bank, lending and factoring, but now going aggressively into the, intelligence and analytics side. On the other hand, DT and Truckstop have both made acquisitions to go from their roots on the freight side, marketplaces and other capabilities, into factoring and related fields. And so, two giants approaching the same opportunity in the middle from opposite sides. Who will win? Don't know who will win, but certainly that battle as you see this evolution from point solution to platform is going to be very very interesting to watch, and certainly I think will produce some multi-billion-dollar winners. So I think that's one. I think two is the AI powered applications. We've talked about some. I'll mention a couple of others. Returns is another big one. We spend $800 billion a year. You alluded to that. With 7 kids, I shudder to think how much gets returned in the Boyer household.
I think I'm just like fueling the entire industry at this point. So yeah.
Well, that can't be because you haven't seen what happens in my house, but maybe the
Okay,
two of
good.
us. So
I'm not alone.
So with 800 billion being returned annually, there's a massive pain point, massive problem, and that needs to be better solved. And so there are multiple candidates, companies that do different things. Genco is a pioneer in this realm. My friend Herb Shear built Genco, grew it, sold it to FedEx for 1.4 billion, and since then a host of other companies. We invested in a company called Reverse Logics, which is using software to basically think of it as like a WMS for automating the returns process. And wonderful, and again powers a number of majors, including FedEx and others, and that's great. But they're not alone. There are others in that realm. Optoro just sold to Blue Yonder a couple of days ago, and there are various others. So there's a huge need to solve that. Similarly, I think there are a handful of other big supply chain problems that are out there. So whether it's post-purchase, last mile, fulfillment, returns, I think you're going to see some multi-billion-dollar companies emerge in those realms. So I think that's second. And then third, it's very trite when people love to quote the Wayne Gretzky line about skating to where the puck is going, but not that many people actually do it. And what does that actually mean here? Well, I'll give you an example, and it's a little bit of inside baseball and something that we're pursuing ourselves right now. But if you think about it, where is there huge supply chain spend? Well, I mean, look, you could look at cross-border, you could look at things where there's strong underlying demand, like healthcare spend that never goes down, even regardless of what the government does, regardless of recession. So fine. There's another one Data centers. The massive demand for data centers because of the massive energy needs of AI. Again, think about those second, third, fourth order ripple effects, just like we were talking about with railroads and ships. One of the third or fourth order ripple effects of the growth of AI is what are the supply chains needed to support it? Well, it turns out that building these massive data centers to be able to fulfill the energy demands of AI is a huge opportunity. Interestingly, we worked with a company. There's a tombstone, you can't see it, right here in my office, for a company called IT Renew, and what they did was what's called ITAD, IT Asset Disposition, for data centers. So think about it like this: you're you know, Apple or Microsoft or Facebook or whomever, you've got these, huge data centers. You've got row after row after row of servers. Think of it as like being on a football field. And it's like, okay, well, if it's Monday, we're replacing everything on the 5 yard line. And if it's Wednesday, it's the 6 yard line. And so there's this cycle for replacing these. And what IT Renew did was they managed that reverse logistics process for the networking equipment. So there's a whole series of opportunity in supply chain around data centers, and that's certainly something that we're actively looking for and investing in. And I would welcome any ideas from anybody listening. If you know great companies anywhere in supply chain, but particularly in areas where the puck is going, of which data center logistics is an example, please reach out to me, because who knows, maybe you and we will team up on our next investment.
So, so smart. There are just articles recently about these big data centers and that need. And it's really cool. I love with AI how many additional ideas and just industries and just everything that can splinter off from it. Really neat. Okay, so thank you so much for being here. Do you have a final piece of advice for shippers, 3PLs, anyone that you have out there for riding this AI wave?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, if you're a shipper, is just make sure you're talking to a company that for which this is the main thing. This is worth noting. If I went back to the early internet days, there were a lot of people that tried to dress up with the trans place. Adding a .com at the end was a really good example. Just because you add a .com at the end of your name doesn't make you a .com company. Uh, just as if you added a .ai to your name or put AI in your tagline, it doesn't make you an AI company. Look for companies where your problem is their main thing, because if it's their main thing, they're a lot more likely to focus on it, focus on you, and do a great job. So I think that's one for shippers. For logistics companies, I think a similar point, with respect to partners, but also B, if you're looking to add capabilities, um, I would think seriously about either buying or partnering with, other true supply chain AI pure play companies that could be the best in a particular realm. I'll give you an example. As we were talking about, I'll use one of the companies we talked about earlier, Parcel Perform. Parcel Perform can go direct to all kinds of these major brands. But one of the things that they figured out was, why go build a giant sales force when you could partner with great logistics companies that already have a giant sales force and their own customers? So it makes a lot of sense if you're a logistics company and something in the post-purchase experience is relevant for you, why not partner with somebody else like a Parcel Perform that has all that? A, it doesn't cost you much up front, because fundamentally it means that you win when they win. It's more like a joint selling arrangement to your customers. B, because they're a pure play, it's their main thing, so you're going to get something better, right? Jack Welch famously said, "Your back office is somebody else's front office, and that's why you should outsource. Work with someone where their business is the number one thing, and it might not be the number one thing for you." And then look, lastly, it also does give you the ability to say your customers that you're giving them true, outstanding, best of breed AI powered technology. So it would be my advice for logistics companies: look for those pure play partners. And then third, look, if you're a supply chain software company, I think the biggest thing that I would say, as an investor, I hear all the time from people that say, oh, well, we don't talk about that. It's confidential, or we're in stealth, or you need an NDA for this or an NDA for that. Look, when I started my first company, I did and said all those things as well. Um, and what I realized was, what I thought was important turned out not to be, because in the end, it's all about execution. So if you're a supply chain technology company and you're building the business, just remember the thing that's going to matter for you most is, how do I scale up? It's a lot less likely that Lori or Ben or hundreds of other people that are out there are going to somehow steal your idea and make it theirs. Mainly because they're busy doing their own thing, but also because it's really hard to do that. Like, it's all about execution. And so if you focus more on how do I go fast and less on how do I prevent anybody from knowing about this thing that I think is really special, the people that focus on getting there faster are usually the ones that win.
Interesting. Okay. Love that. That's totally a hot take there from Ben Gordon. So thank you so much again for being here. Totally going to have you back in 3 years, and we're going to see how all these predictions went out to play. But thank you again so much.
Lori, thank you. Great to be with you.
We'll see you all next time.